Hello, and welcome to the Online Strength Coach Podcast, episode 90, pause reps, low reps, high sets.
Hey, I can be the answer. I'm ready to dance when the vamp up. Then when I hit that dip, get your camera. You can see when that bitch shakes the camera. In the lean, that young sisterly. In the bitch who wants to compete. And I can freak fit that pump bitch the deep. And you know what your bitch become with.
Hello, and welcome to episode 90 of the Online Strength Coach Podcast. Today's topic comes from a question on YouTube. Questions from Jean Francis Enemy. Hi Marc, I have one or two questions for you. The first one is about using less reps and more sets. I've been doing this in my training for the past 2 months. I really like it, but I'm having trouble keeping track of my progress using this method. For example, before I was working over 3 weeks towards 2 sets of 5 at 85%, 4 reps at 80%, 4 reps at 85%, and then I knew that on my deload stroke test week, I would hit 5 reps at 85%. But now using 3 sets of 3 at 75%, 2 sets of 2 at 80%, 2 sets of 2 at 85% as target for my third week, I find that even if I hit all the reps on week 3, it doesn't guarantee I will get 5 reps at 85% the following week. I find this is really easy to lie to yourself about your capacities with the low rep, high sets method. Do you have any advice to track more accurately one's progress when using low reps, high sets? My second question is about pause work for squat, bench, and deadlift. I was listening to a podcast about gymnastics training, the last Tim Ferriss podcast, and one of the takeaway messages was that for any type of movement pattern, you first need to develop the required flexibility, then you need to prove stability through the entire range of motion before being able to add movement and external load. So translated to powerlifting, would it be intelligent for beginners or intermediate lifters to start a training block by focusing on pause work to develop good flexibility and stability before going towards an overload phase and then a taper? In general, how would you use pause work? Cheers, Jeff. Cheers for the questions, Jeff. Quite interesting. We'll start off with the first one. So I think you provide quite a nice example here of the volumes and intensities that you might use. So if we look at your example on the first one, 2 sets of 5 is 10 reps volume at 75%. 3 sets of 3 is 1 rep less volume, and also you have to appreciate when you split the volume up, it becomes less taxing, less fatiguing, which is the goal of splitting the volume up into more sets. But we'll explain a bit later how that might be a negative thing depending on your frequency of training. And then 4 reps at 80%, 2 sets of 2 is the same volume, the same intensity, and then 4 reps at 85%, 2 sets of 2 in your other example is the same. Okay, so when you utilize, or when you look to plan any training cycle, when you look to plan your programming, what you should be looking at total volume. You should be looking at a measure of intensity. So what I've been using since February, since going to the Barashiko seminar, it's just been average intensity of the week, average intensity of the session. I find it's quite a good way of gauging it. If you use flat sets and reps, it's very easy to gauge that sort of thing. It's typically in a flat sets and reps scheme, you'll usually start off with something like 5 sets of 5, like the cycle that I mention all the time, which is quite a good cycle. 5 sets of 5 is 75%. Obviously, the intensity there is 75%. 5 sets of 4 at 80%. 5 sets of 3 at 85%. Week 1, week 2, week 3. You can see quite easily the volume melts away and the intensity creeps up. Quite easy to see that. However, when you're utilizing more reps, more sets, becomes more difficult, especially when you're looking. I assume this is done as like one session. Oh no, these are ones. Okay, I get it now. For example, before I was using over 3 periods. So 2 sets of 5 reps was week 1. 4 reps was week 2. 4 reps was at 85% was week 3. I see. Anyway, so I got sidetracked there. So when you utilize like more of a varied percentage in sets and reps, so for example, a session could be 4 sets of 4, 70%, 3 sets of 3 at 75%, 2 sets of 2 at 80% on one exercise. That's an example of how multiple sets and reps would typically be initiated into a program. Certainly if you are influenced by Chico or some of the other higher volume programs out there, the sets, the reps, and the volumes, intensities will be spread out. So having a measure of total volume, basically how many reps are completed within the session, and average intensity, gives you a nice view of how the week is, how the session is, how that exercise is. It lets you modify and plan. You can say, I would like for my overload week, I'm going to do 400 reps at an average intensity of around 64 to 66% as my overload week, and then you can play with that. So you can have reps that are in the 80%, reps in the 70 or 70%, reps in the 60%. You can use different variations. You can just kind of play with it as you go. It's a much more flexible way of training. However, it's difficult for someone who is not experienced with programming or experienced with putting together periodization cycles or routines. It can be difficult to track. It can be very difficult even for someone who is very experienced with programming, very experienced with putting together training cycles, but utilizes kind of flat sets and reps. They just kind of go right 5 sets 5, like that kind of cycle that I mentioned beforehand. If they're that's nice and easy to work with. It's very intuitive, very easy to understand how intensity and volume can be manipulated from week to week. However, when you start spreading your loads, start spreading your intensities over more sets, more reps, it becomes a lot more difficult to track the intensities, the volumes, see where the overload's coming, plan where the overload is, plan your recovery weeks, etc., etc. So basically, what you're seeing here is you've taken, so we'll take 2 sets of 5. So if you're training once a week, what you need to do is you need to present an overload in that session. So if you're doing 2 sets of 5 at 75%, it's quite an easy session. If you break that into 3 sets of 3 at 75%, it's a much easier session because you've taken, well, for one, you've reduced the volume, but you've also split the volume up. So splitting volume up, although the benefits of it is that it allows better execution, more practice of the setup, more practice of taking it out, more practice of execution. Execution is generally better. You tend to utilize muscles that you'll actually utilize in a maximum lift because you'll use decent technique. Although it has all of these things going for it, when the frequency is low, that's when you get into trouble. So if you're using a frequency of 1, as in you're training once a week with this kind of protocol, for one, your sessions are very, very easy. They're not really going to produce an overload as it is. Like 2 sets of 5, 75% is very easy. 4 reps at 80% is quite easy. 4 reps at 85% is fairly difficult. But if it's only one set, then there's no real overload being presented. If you take that 2 sets of 2 at 85% and don't have any more volume, any more sets beforehand, as in your session is 2 sets of 2 at 85%, then you have very low volume, you have a reasonable intensity, but if you're only training once a week, your total volume for the week's nothing. For example, for like an average sort of lifter that I would program for, some higher, better volumes, some higher, less volumes, but if I'm utilizing kind of the lower sets and reps period, the lowest frequency I would utilize would be 2. A frequency of 3 to 4, depending on the exercise, can be used as well. And like a low volume week for that lift would be somewhere between 40 to 60 reps. A high volume week might be somewhere from like 80 to 120 reps over varying percentages. Again, only counting reps over 50%. Although I would think I might even go towards only cutting reps over 60%. But within that context, there's plenty of overload being presented to that lifter in that week. or there's less overload, or there's no overload, or it's a recovery week, depending on the goal of the week, will alter what we do within that week, what's gone prior, what's coming up, if you're peaking, etc., etc. All of that plays into how you program from week to week. But basically what I'm trying to get at here is you're not really providing any form of overload here. What you could do with these sets and rep schemes would be like using the percentages that you used. The 5x5 at 75% is 25 reps at 75%. That will produce an overload. 5 sets of 4 at 80%. Again, that will produce an overload in itself. 20 reps at 80%. And then 5 sets of 3 at 85%. Again, will produce an overload. And then when you go on to your 5 reps at 85%, if you've done 5 sets of 3 the previous week, it'll be a piece of piss. And then what I would do would be to ask the question, what's the point in 5 reps at 85% as a marker or as a deload, when in fact that's the most difficult week in your program? It all depends on the frequency you're using. If you're using a low frequency, another good program you can utilize with a frequency of 1 is 3 sets of 10 at 75%, 3 sets of 8 at 78%, week 2, week 3, 3 sets of 6 at 83.5%, week 4, 4x4 at 88%, and then week 5, 3x3 at 9%. That's a very good 1 day a week program that I've utilized quite a lot in the past that you'll definitely get results with in the power lifts like squat, bench, deadlift. Obviously not something you would probably utilize for cleans because that would just be silly. Okay, so I hope that's answered your question, probably in more of a roundabout way than you would like, I would assume. However, hopefully you can hopefully I've interpreted your question correctly and you've got out of that what you want. Okay, so for the next one, for the pause work. Pause work's a great teaching tool. It is something that I definitely utilize with beginners. It's something that I definitely utilize with intermediates, and it's something that I definitely utilize with advanced lifters. Because quite a lot of the time, just because you're strong doesn't mean your technique's good. There's quite a lot of strong lifters who lift with very bad technique, and it's always good to be reminded of what a good position is, where the good position is, and it induces control. So within a beginner's context, for example, with weightlifting, if we're going to go into a clean or we're going to go into like a snatch session and it's like the first kind of session they've done or it's the second session or like they're still pretty green, what I'll do is I'll do like high rep, high set pause overhead squat or high rep, high set pause front squat, just to utilize it as a stretch, but also to utilize it as a lift specific warm up. They're going to get into end range in the position that they're going to catch the weight when we move on to like a hang clean or a hang snatch or a muscle snatch or whatever the teaching progression is for the day. And when you pause things, then we can talk about how you execute, give you a bit more feedback, give you more understanding of how you're executing. So if you're doing a pause overhead squat, for example, then when we pause at the bottom, I can come around, have a look at you, can say, look, your knees are in slightly, you need to push them out this way. And when you push your knees out, you need to push your hips forward a bit more. When you lock the bar out, you need to do this when you do it, like turn your elbows out, shrug up, push your head forward. We can talk about where the bar is in relation to your sideway profile. There's loads of stuff we can do to help the person understand what they're looking for when they go into the actual movement. Very useful tool with beginners. It's something I don't necessarily think that you should just do exclusively pause work, because you need to understand the dynamics of the movement when you move through it. You need to understand what it's like when you move through with intention as well. So beginners, intermediates all need to be exposed at some stage to having to push through a heavier set. I don't think you necessarily have to lift like heavy weights or limit weights or go to like rep outs or do limit sets, because it will encourage bad movement patterns and maybe teach bad techniques. But what we definitely need to do at some stage is learn what it feels like to push through a heavy weight, and to adjust as maybe as you come out of line in a squat because you raise with your hips too quickly, or your weight shifted forward, or your knees caved in, and because your knees caved in, your arse kicked out. You got to push the boat out, kind of to know where you need to concentrate. Your training every now and again. It probably use a lower frequency with beginners. Probably the lifter that I would do this kind of training more with would be an intermediate. Advanced lifters with good technique, I wouldn't really do this kind of training unless looking to overload them or get them overreached or in competition. So where I would utilize pause work within a powerlifting context, pause squat obviously is great for developing control on the bottom. It's great for learning how to stand up out of the bottom. And for people who struggle, maybe they rock forward out of the bottom, balance goes forward, arse comes up first. Pause squat's a great tool, especially longer duration pauses are a great tool to teach that person how to drive out of the whole chest first, how to keep strong with the torso and not let the bar bow them. Then the bench press, that's specific to the lift. Pause bench presses are absolutely essential for powerlifters. Should be trained. It probably should be your primary movement for bench press. Should be pause bench, so that's a non sequitur really. That's how you use it. Is how you perform it. And then within deadlift, immensely useful drill is like pausing just off the floor to teach. Kind of as Pete Rubish put across in or Rubish put across in one of the strength or the super training videos with Marc Bell. It's one of his drills for teaching how to stay strong for the bottom. It's like the pause about a couple inches off the floor once you've broken it. And one thing that helped my lockout immensely was below the knee pauses on the deadlift. Just teaches like a more efficient technique. It teaches you to pull the bar into you as you try to lock it out with your hips. Very useful drill. And then within the context of bench press as well, if someone lacks control or someone has a bad bar path or they have bad bar control, then spotto press as is now become known, although I'd probably more like to call it Thompson press. That's the guy who taught me. It showed me the lift initially, basically where you just bench and you don't touch the chest, you're in control the whole time, constant tension the whole time. Work like that is quite good. Within the squat you can do tempos, you can pause halfway up, pause at the bottom, pause in different planes. Just puts the movement in a different context. Can help people concentrate on their technique a little bit more. It gives them more feedback as well because it's slower and they have more control over what they're doing. So there is no real easy way to put it across. Those are some of the ways that I would utilize it within powerlifting. As regards having the flexibility and then having the stability through the movement, those are good principles. And definitely something I would utilize, as we kind of talked about prior, how I approach Olympic lifting or weightlifting. Within powerlifting, it's also pretty good method. But the powerlifting movements are very, very simple. The flexibility demands are low. Generally, the skill level is very low initially. It becomes higher when you start handling heavier poundages. And they don't really, I wouldn't think they have the complexity or the amount of flexibility that you would want to adopt like a very segmented, slow approach. Like when I teach someone to squat, we're going to squat in the first session, whereas when I teach someone to snatch, we might not get past like a very broken down version. So like a muscle snatch or a 4-part, what I call a 4-part snatch, where you just kind of pause it, all the perform slow with a very light load, and we pause at all the key landmarks that we need to come through in a correct executed snatch or clean. So that's a much more complex movement with much higher flexibility demands. So how I would teach clean and snatch is definitely different to how I teach squat, deadlift, and bench press. I think probably the best way for those to be learned is to be done with high volumes, low loads, and have constant feedback for the person doing it as they're a beginner for the first 6 months or whatever. That will really, if you're coaching someone like your missus or whoever, and you're with them session to session, the best thing you can do for them is to keep their training very light and just be all feedback based, just be all technique based, and you'll set them up for a very good base from which to push on afterwards. Okay, that's going to conclude the episode. Hope you found it interesting. We've answered both your questions, quite good questions. Episode 100 in 9 episodes time, which is sweet. Don't know if we'll do something special for that. Probably will. It's getting up to the year anniversary as well. It might even be the year anniversary of this Online Strength Coach podcast. So if you're one of the regular listeners, thank you very much. As always, any questions, comments, please leave them below on the YouTube. I can be got at speedpowerperformance@gmail.com for any questions, inquiries you have regarding anything, online services or whatever you require. You can check me out online, gastironstrength.com. It's my blog. And also I will definitely be developing an online strength coach within the next 4 weeks because I've got a bit of time, so it's actually going to happen. I promise, although possibly not because I promise this quite a lot in this podcast. Okay, thank you very much for listening. I'll catch you next time. Cheers.
She wanna lick my plum